1952. A Tuesday evening in a kitchen outside Cleveland, Ohio. Something is simmering on the stove that does not have a recipe card because nobody thought to write it down. Every woman on this street is making the same thing tonight, and every woman on this street learned it the same way, by standing next to someone who already knew. There are 25 dishes on this list. Every single one of them fed this country for decades, and now you have to dig to find any of them. Chicken and dumplings. Not the thin broth version with gummy store-bought dumplings dropped in from a tube. The real one. Fat rolled dumplings made from lard and flour, cooked low and slow in the same broth the chicken had been simmering in since morning. A whole chicken, 19 cents a pound in 1953, stretched into a meal that fed 6 people and still left enough for lunch the next day. Lard was the key, and lard is the thing nobody uses anymore. Creamed chipped beef on toast. The military called it something unprintable, and so did everyone else who ate it growing up. Dried beef, 23 cents a jar, shredded thin and folded into a white sauce made from butter and flour and whole milk, poured hot over thick white toast. It was breakfast and lunch, and it cost almost nothing. Every family in America knew this dish by a different nickname, which is how you know it was everywhere. Tuna noodle casserole. This is not a joke, and it is not a bad recipe. 2 cans of Campbell's cream of mushroom soup, a can of tuna in oil, not water, egg noodles cooked just past al dente, and a top layer of crushed Ritz crackers browned in the oven until they looked like something you would actually eat. Cream of mushroom soup was 12 cents a can in 1956, and that casserole was on more American tables than almost anything else in this decade. The reason it disappeared is that people started being embarrassed by cheap food. That is the industry talking, not common sense. Johnny Marzetti. If you grew up in Ohio, you know exactly what this is. If you did not, nobody can explain why it was called that, because nobody ever could. Ground beef browned with onion and green pepper, a can of tomato soup, macaroni, and enough cheddar melted on top to qualify as a second course. It was the dish that appeared at every church potluck, every school cafeteria, every covered dish supper, from 1940 to 1975, and then it just quietly retired from public life without anyone voting on it. Mock apple pie. This one takes a minute to understand. During the Depression and well into the 1950s, apples were not always available or affordable. So someone at Nabisco, or more likely a housewife who never got credit for it, figured out that Ritz crackers soaked in a syrup of water, sugar, cream of tartar, and lemon juice baked inside a normal pie crust tasted almost exactly like apple pie. Not a little bit like it. Almost exactly. Cream of tartar was the secret. The recipe is still on the Ritz box today, and almost nobody notices it. Depression chocolate cake. No eggs, no milk, no butter. Made with vinegar and baking soda for the rise, vegetable oil, or bacon drippings instead of butter, cocoa powder, and strong black coffee for depth. This cake was born in the 1930s when eggs cost money that families did not have, and it was still being made by grandmothers in the 1950s and 60s who had not forgotten the lesson. It is called wacky cake or crazy cake, depending on where you learned it, and it is one of the few recipes from that era that bakers are actively bringing back right now, because it turns out the no-egg version is actually the better version. Salmon Croquettes. This is one of the great forgotten weeknight dinners of mid-century America. A can of pink salmon, bones mashed in because the bones are calcium and nobody wasted them, mixed with cracker crumbs, egg, onion, and a little mustard, formed into oval patties and pan-fried in bacon drippings until the outside was crisp and almost crackling. Pink salmon was 29 cents a can in 1954. The croquettes were served with a simple white sauce or creamed peas, and the whole meal cost less than 40 cents to feed a family of 4. Liver and onions. This is the dish that every grandparent remembers and every grandchild refuses to try. Beef liver, thinly sliced, dredged in seasoned flour, cooked fast in a very hot cast-iron skillet until the outside seared brown, while the inside stayed pink and tender, finished with caramelized onions and a pour of bacon drippings over the top. The reason this dish has a bad reputation is that modern cooking does it wrong, cooking it slowly until it turns gray and bitter. The 1950s version was done in 6 minutes and tasted nothing like the version you think you remember. Stuffed cabbage rolls, called pigs in blankets in some regions, golabki in Polish kitchens, sarma in Eastern European households, but in mainstream mid-century American cooking, it was simply stuffed cabbage, and it was on the stove in half the houses on every immigrant street in the country. Ground beef and rice packed into softened cabbage leaves, arranged in a baking dish, covered with a tomato sauce that was mostly Campbell's tomato soup, thinned with water, and baked low and slow for 2 hours while the house filled up with something that smelled like Sunday. American chop suey. Nothing to do with China. This is the great New England school lunch dish, also called American goulash, or slumgullion depending on the state you grew up in. Ground beef cooked with onion and green pepper, stirred into tomato sauce, tossed with elbow macaroni that had been cooked separately, and served in deep bowls with a square of white sandwich bread on the side. Every school cafeteria in the northeastern United States served this on Wednesdays for 30 years. The kids who hated it are now the adults who are looking for the recipe. Chicken a la king. In the 1950s, this was a company dish, something you made when guests were coming and you wanted it to look like you had made an effort. Cooked chicken cut into pieces, folded into a cream sauce built from butter, flour, and chicken broth, with sliced mushrooms and pimento peppers stirred in, served over white rice or toasted white bread that had been cut diagonally on a proper plate. It appeared in nearly every edition of Better Homes and Gardens from 1948 to 1965. You can still make it from scratch in 20 minutes, and it is still very good. Ham and scalloped potatoes. This is what happened to the leftover Easter ham, which was itself what happened to the money set aside for something special. Thinly sliced potatoes layered with thin sliced onion and chunks of leftover ham, covered with a white sauce made from scratch, or sometimes just with whole milk, topped with breadcrumbs, and baked until the potatoes were tender and the top had browned to something you had to wait in the kitchen for. Every cut of the ham that was not sliced on Sunday went into this dish on Monday. Nothing was wasted. That was not a value. That was just what you did. Potato soup with bacon drippings. Not loaded potato soup from a chain restaurant with shredded cheese and sour cream on top. The original version, which is nearly nothing. Cubed potatoes simmered in water or weak chicken broth with onion and celery until they were falling apart, then partially mashed right in the pot to thicken the liquid, finished with a pour of bacon drippings and salt. That is the entire recipe. In Pennsylvania Dutch kitchens, it was made with milk instead of water, which made it slightly richer. But in leaner households, the bacon drippings were the fat and the flavor both. The whole pot cost less than 15 cents to make in 1957. Monday hash. In 1950s households, nothing left the Sunday roast table without a purpose. The beef or pork that was left after Sunday dinner became Monday hash. Cubed roast meat, diced boiled potatoes, and onion all fried together in the roasting pan drippings until the bottom crust was dark and the whole thing smelled like the meal you had made the day before. A fried egg on top was optional but almost universal. There is no version of this dish that is not completely satisfying, and yet it essentially does not exist anymore as a deliberate recipe because people stopped making Sunday roasts, and there is nothing left to turn into hash. Prune cake with brown sugar frosting. This sounds terrible, and it is one of the best cakes ever made in an American kitchen. Prunes were stewed soft, then pushed through a sieve to make a thick, sweet paste that went directly into the batter in place of some of the fat. The result was a cake that was so moist it did not need to be refrigerated for days. Brown sugar frosting was made from butter, brown sugar, and cream cooked to the soft ball stage and then beaten until it was thick and fudgy. Prunes were a staple pantry item in the 1950s, 15 cents a box, and this cake appeared in every community cookbook from 1940 to 1970. It has almost completely disappeared. Waldorf Salad. Not the version you get now, which has been adjusted and lightened and revised until it barely resembles itself. The original 1950s home version was cubed apples, halved grapes, sliced celery, and walnut pieces folded into real Hellmann's mayonnaise, not light, not a substitute Hellmann's, and served in a bowl lined with iceberg lettuce leaves. That was it. Hellmann's was 45 cents a jar in 1958, and it was treated as an ingredient, not a condiment. The version of this salad that appears in 1950s cookbooks and community church recipe cards is better than anything called Waldorf Salad that you will find today. Bean and ham hock soup. The ham hock was the part of the pig that nobody wanted to pay full price for, which is exactly why it made the best soup. A smoked ham hock simmered in water for 2 hours before a single white bean went in, and by the time the beans were tender, the broth had turned rich and slightly smoky and thick from the collagen in the joint. Dried navy beans were a pantry staple, 10 cents a pound, and this soup was made on wash day because it could go on the stove early and look after itself while the rest of the house was being maintained. Nobody eats ham hocks anymore. The broth they make is still unbeatable. Tamale pie. This was the 1950s shortcut version of tamales, invented by cooks who loved the flavor but did not have the time or the community kitchen to make the real thing. Ground beef seasoned with chili powder and cumin, cooked with tomatoes and canned corn, poured into a baking dish and topped with a thick cornmeal mush that baked into a crust. The cornmeal top was the whole point. It set into something between a polenta and a cornbread, and when you scooped through it into the filling underneath it, was one of those combinations that should not work as well as it does. It vanished from mainstream American cooking sometime around 1975 and never really came back. Deviled eggs. These were never casual. In a 1950s household, deviled eggs appeared at funerals, church suppers, bridge club, and 4th of July picnics, and the woman who made them was always known for them. The filling was yolk, Hellmann's, dry mustard, a pinch of sugar, white vinegar and paprika on top, and the proportions were never written down. They were adjusted by feel. Every woman had a version that was slightly different and strongly defended. Nobody uses dry mustard anymore. Nobody adds the pinch of sugar. And somehow the eggs are never quite as good. Oyster Stew. In certain American households, this was the Christmas Eve meal, and nothing else was acceptable. A can of shucked oysters in their liquor, a quart of whole milk heated slowly with butter until it was steaming but never boiling. The oysters added at the last moment and cooked just long enough to plump slightly, served in deep bowls with oyster crackers floated on top. The entire dish was made in 15 minutes and cost about 35 cents in 1955. In coastal families and Catholic households from Maryland to Massachusetts, it was as fixed a tradition as the tree itself. It is essentially gone now because people are afraid of canned oysters. Chocolate mayonnaise cake. This sounds wrong. It is not wrong. Hellmann's published this recipe in 1937, and American women were still making it in the 1950s and 60s because mayonnaise is oil and eggs, which are exactly what a chocolate cake needs. The result is the moistest chocolate cake you will make from scratch, with a tight crumb that holds together when sliced and stays fresh without drying out for 3 days. Hellmann's was the brand, and Hellmann's was the ingredient, and the cake was better than any boxed mix that followed. The recipe was on the back of the jar for decades. Then the jar changed. The recipe disappeared. The cake did too. Creamed corn from scratch. Not the can. Before Del Monte and Green Giant had covered every shelf in every grocery store in the country, corn cream was made from ears of fresh sweet corn in summer and from dried corn run through a grinder in winter, and it was something completely different from what the can contains. Fresh corn scraped from the cob with the back of the knife to release the milk, cooked in butter with a little cream and salt until thick. It was a side dish and a topping and sometimes a soup base. The canned version became so dominant that the scratch version now sounds like a specialty dish. It was once just how you made corn. Strawberry preserves put up in July. The act of canning was not a hobby in the 1950s. It was a July obligation. Flats of strawberries bought at the farm stand for 25 cents, cooked down with sugar to the exact temperature where they would gel without setting too firm, ladled into sterilized mason jars, the lids sealed and inverted to vacuum, stored in the root cellar or the dark pantry shelf. Those jars lasted until March. The woman who made them knew exactly how many she needed to get through the winter, because she had been keeping that count since she was old enough to hand jars to her own mother. Nobody counts jars anymore. Beef stew with a biscuit top. Not pot pie with a pastry crust. Not stew in a bowl. The version where the biscuit dough was dropped in spoonfuls over the surface of the simmering stew in the last 20 minutes of cooking. The lid kept on, so the steam rose up and cooked the bottoms, while the oven or the stovetop heat crisped the tops. The stew underneath thickened from the flour that dredged the beef at the beginning. The biscuits absorbed the gravy from below. The whole thing came to the table in the pot it was cooked in, and there was never quite enough of it. This dish does not exist in restaurants. It barely exists in cookbooks. It existed in kitchens. 25 recipes. Not one of them required a specialty store. Not one of them needed a recipe printed off the internet. Every single one of them lived in someone's hands and was passed forward by watching, not reading. That is why they are gone. The kitchen remembers, even when we forget. If any of these triggered a memory, or if your grandmother made something that belongs on this list, leave it in the comments. And if you know someone who is still making any of these, tell them not to stop.